Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all for coming. To my left, I have Alex Chalk and George Penny, and to my right, I have Max Wilkinson and George Rudgeon. Now, each candidate will give a 5-minute speech, starting from Mr. Chalk.
Okay. Do you mind if I stand to do that? Great. Well, look, first of all, thank you very, very much, Matt and Alex, for giving me the opportunity to say a few words. So do you know what? Politicians are fond of saying at election time that this is the most important election in a generation. Well, this time it really is, because the future direction of our country is at stake. And the implications also of what happens here in Cheltenham could not be more stark. And the reason why I say that is because wherever you sit in the political spectrum, whether you read The Guardian or the Daily Mail or you get all your news from social media, people recognise that what happens here will have a big impact. And that's because with the Liberal Democrats saying that they would never go into a coalition with the Conservatives, even if that was the only way to stop Jeremy Corbyn becoming Prime Minister, that the implications are basically either you have a majority Conservative government or Jeremy Corbyn is asked to form a government. Now, you may say that's a great thing, but one thing that is not in dispute is that what happens here really matters. Now, of course, nothing could be in some ways more important than this issue of Brexit. Now, let me be clear. I was a Remainer. I didn't just vote Remain. I campaigned for Remain. And so even though, however, I find myself in that position, if you look at the alternatives that are being posited for how we should move forward as compared to leaving with this deal, they're deeply, deeply unattractive. So on the one hand, you have the option to leave with a deal, which sorts out the money, which sorts out citizens' rights. Or you suggest that we should just revoke the whole thing. But I, even as a Remainer, think that that would be fundamentally undemocratic. The idea that it would draw a line under the whole affair is, forget it. It would pour petrol onto the flames. People would say, why on earth should I ever vote again? You haven't met us halfway. You haven't met us anyway. You just basically ignore what we have to say. And the issue of a second referendum, it might sound quite appealing, and I could kind of almost understand the argument if I thought that the polls showed that maybe Remain might win 60-40, but the polls don't show that. What they show instead is at the end of a 6-month process, because there isn't just a button you press and out comes a referendum, there has to be primary legislation. In other words, it's got to go through the House of Commons, got to go through the House of Lords. There'd be an almighty argument about what the question should be, what the franchise should be. Should 16-year-olds be able to vote? Should EU nationals be able to vote? And at the end of that process, a process which would toxify school environments, toxify workplaces, toxify family dining tables, the losing side wouldn't accept the result. And we know that because Jo Swinson has said, even if Leave won again, she'd still be saying, well, no, we should be remaining. And can you imagine if Remain won, do you think Leave would go, oh, yeah, fair enough, actually, yeah, what were we thinking? That wouldn't happen at all. They'd find a reason to say there was something wrong about it. It might not be a bus, but they'd say, oh, well, there was Russian money in it, or the North Koreans did something. And so, look, even if I didn't vote for this, I think we have to move forward because your generation has got to understand what that new normal is. And there will still be people who say it's a little bit better or a little bit worse, but we've got to get to that new point because delay in and of itself is corrosive. Just as if you have a mug of tea and you put your sugar lump in it, don't expect it to look the same a minute later. It starts to corrode and it's having that corrosive effect. So that's the issue of Brexit. I came into politics to talk about all the other stuff. I am so passionate about Cheltenham. I'm passionate about having strong public services, but here's the really important point. Strong public services that are supported by a fantastic local economy that provides great opportunities for people like you. So the reason why we've been able to keep our A&E, which is something that I've really been so passionate about, is because we've been able to use influence in Parliament to get those sorts of results. But I'm passionate about schools as well. We changed the old unfair funding formula, which meant schools like this were underfunded compared to the national average. But how do you go about supporting all this stuff? I believe if you want to find true social mobility, if you want to discover what Winston Churchill referred to as the treasure in the heart of every man or woman, you have to provide opportunity. And that's why when I was elected in 2015, I thought, what can we do here in Cheltenham, the home of GCHQ, to drive true opportunity in a place which has areas of entrenched deprivation? And that's why I went to government. I said to the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, we could have a cyber innovation centre in Cheltenham, where the finest minds from GCHQ can go out and unlock potential. So if you have a great cybersecurity idea, that could be nurtured, enhanced, progressed, and you could go on to achieve great things with your life. All of this, however, can only be achieved in a clean society. That's why I introduced the Net Zero Carbon Emissions Bill, which means that ours is the first country, mind you, in the G7 to legally commit to net zero. We can have a better, fairer, better public services, stronger economy if we just vote Conservative and get Brexit done. Thank you.
Hand over to Mr. Penny.
So Alex is absolutely right to say that this is the most important election for a generation, because at this election we're setting the direction in this country not just for the next 5 years but the next 30 and the 30 that follow that. We're deciding at this election, do we head down the path we're currently going, where we're facing a climate crisis, where we're seeing ever rising levels of inequality in our country, or do we take the other path, the path Labour is proposing, where we respond robustly to the climate crisis by getting down to net zero carbon emissions by 2030 while still growing our economy, while developing this country into a global leader on climate change, both diplomatically and technologically? Do we continue with the spiralling inequality where the very wealthiest get richer and richer, where mega corporations continue to fail to pay their fair share in our society, where we see thousands and thousands of people, even here in Cheltenham, relying on food banks? Do we see the spiralling homelessness which has continued over the last 9 years going on and on into the future? Do we see a 13-year funding freeze in real terms in school funding, or do we take Labour's option? Proper funding of our public services, proper contributions from the very wealthiest in our society. We have an option here to change the very fundamentals of the way our society works, so it doesn't just work for the privileged few, but works for the many. A society in which we ensure that everyone, no matter the circumstances of their birth, can achieve whatever it is they wish in their lives. Where we fund schools like this one properly, where we increase in real terms funding across the next 5 years of our Parliament, where we invest in 1,000 new Sure Start centres up and down this country to ensure that every child has a proper start in life, where we invest in our NHS, a £26.5 billion NHS rescue fund to end the marketisation and privatisation which has seen standards of care slipping, which has seen our hospital estates becoming substandard, which has seen the clinicians which we rely on so essentially in our services becoming ever more disenfranchised and disenchanted with the direction the NHS is heading. Do we leave our society in a position where students like you have to worry about taking on an enormous burden of student debt in order to go to university, or do we say no, we can afford to pay for our students to learn at university without having to pay any tuition fees, where we say that those who need it should be entitled to access to funding, to bursaries, to maintenance grants to make sure that university is affordable and open to everyone? And once you've graduated from university, do we say that's where education ends? Or do we, as the Labour Party proposes, build a national education service so throughout your life you have the access to skills training, to traditional academic education, and in all these wonderful opportunities to develop yourselves throughout your life? As we move into the next century, we're going to be seeing a fundamental rebalancing in the way our society works. Automation is ever growing, new technologies are constantly changing the way our economy and the way our industries work, and we need to be ready for these challenges. We need to be ready to say in the 2050s that mass parts of our society may need to retrain, and that's why something like the National Education Service is so important, to ensure that as our economy changes, as technology reforms the way we live our lives, we're able to meet those challenges, reskill and enter those highly skilled, high-quality jobs which the Labour Party will be developing through our Green Industrial Revolution. And then, what do people want in housing? We need to make sure that we're controlling rents, making sure that we don't see spiralling rents that we've seen across this country over the last few years. We need to make sure that those on lower incomes have access to good quality housing provided by local councils, which is green, which is installed with heat pumps and the other technologies which will ensure that we can have a sustainable climate as the foundation of a society throughout the next century. It's about making sure that those who are worst off in our society are protected, that safety net, that cradle to the grave idea embodied in that Labour manifesto so long ago in the 1940s is protected and continued and expanded in our society. So no one has to be homeless. No one has to rely on a food bank. It's about making sure that we resolve the Brexit crisis within 6 months by taking a 3-month renegotiation to make sure that we have a deal which, unlike Boris Johnson's disaster deal, doesn't put a border down the Irish Sea, doesn't leave us vulnerable to a trade deal with Donald Trump's America, which could see changes to the way our pharmaceuticals are priced, which could put the NHS at a far greater cost than it is today. It's about making sure that we continue our commitment to environmental standards with the European Union and build that close future relationship with our closest trading partners. And it's about putting that deal back to the people to let them have the final say, to decide at the end of this 3-year conversation, do we continue in the direction we set in 2016 and leave with that good deal, or do we decide that actually it's time to remain, work with the European Union and move forward? And it's about making sure that Britain recognises its international obligations not just to its European partners, but to people across the world by building a new internationalism, not one founded on violence, but one founded on a cause of peace, a mission of working with everybody to ensure that human rights are protected across the globe and that Britain's world-leading diplomatic service, through massive investment, can continue into the next century and be a great leader both in terms of the climate and in every other issue which faces our planet and faces our country today. So I urge you all at this election to take this opportunity to fundamentally change the direction of this country, to take us down that brighter future and to vote Labour for the many, not the few.
Thank you, Mr. Penny. To now move on to Mr. Wilkinson.
Thank you. A delight to be referred to by Mr. Wilkinson. We tend to just go with Max, so please do. So for too many people, things just aren't working like they should in this country. Labour and the Conservatives, who you've heard from already, have failed time and again over the past century to deliver the better deal that they have promised for the country. But the Liberal Democrats have an ambitious plan. It's an ambitious plan where every person, every community and our planet can thrive. And you won't be surprised to hear that part of our plan is stopping Brexit. Because no matter what they say about what they're going to deliver for the country, if we risk going ahead with leaving the European Union, our country will be worse off. We will have less money to spend on all of our public services, like the school that we're currently sitting in, like the hospital where we go when we're sick, and crucially, public services like dealing with the huge crisis that we have in our environment. If we go ahead with Boris Johnson's Brexit deal over the next 5 years, we will be £50 billion worse off. That's £10 billion per year that we could be spending on schools, on hospitals, and dealing with the environmental crisis. Brexit is not a done deal, and we don't have to go ahead with it. And I urge you at this election to reject the negativity that's being put forward by the other parties and say we're going to stop Brexit to build a fairer future for all of you. Now, everyone is saying that they're bored of Brexit, and I agree with you. So we should stop Brexit and then move on to dealing with the other issues. And we can't deal with those issues if we're doing what Alex suggests. And in Cheltenham, you have a choice. You have a choice of a Liberal Democrat MP who will stop Brexit and help your public services, or a Conservative MP who will go ahead with Brexit, tank the economy, and mean that we don't have enough money to go around. But, having said that, let's talk about the other big issue, and the one that young people talk to me about all the time, which is, of course, the environment. It is an existential crisis that is facing not just our town and our country, but our whole planet. We have 1 million species on the verge of extinction. We know that we are pumping out too much carbon into our environment, which is causing the planet to be too warm in the summers and to be too cold in the winters. People in our country, in our town, are dying, and we have a moral duty to make sure that we're putting it right. That's why in Cheltenham, I took a motion to the Borough Council to make sure that we have locally declared an environment emergency. We are now on course to have a carbon neutral Cheltenham by 2030. We're one of the first councils in the country to do that, and I'm personally very proud of that achievement. But at this election, of course, it's not just about our town, it's about our country too. And I'm proud that the Liberal Democrats are standing on a manifesto which includes a plan for a carbon neutral Britain. And the Observer has praised that as being the most deliverable plan of all the political parties. It even includes how we're going to deal with international aviation, which has been ignored by other parties. We're also going to make sure that by 2030, as part of our plan, all of our homes in this country are insulated so we can reduce our energy bills. And on an important point of equality, we're going to start with the homes of the poorest people, meaning that we're tackling fuel poverty while we're dealing with the environmental crisis. Of course, there's much more to dealing with the environmental crisis, including how we'll get around in our town, how we'll get around our country, and we're going to decarbonise transport too. Aside from the environment, of course, we're in a school, so it's important to deal with the point about education. Now, the Schools Cuts website, in contrast to what Alex claims, tells us that every school in Cheltenham, apart from one, has less money than it did in 2015. Now, I personally will believe what the teachers tell me, rather than what the Conservative Party tells me is happening in our schools. The Liberal Democrats have a plan to reverse those cuts to schools that have happened since 2015, and by the end of the next Parliament, invest £10.7 billion extra in our schools. That will be as part of a reform to our education system, which starts with early years, right down to children of 9 months old, all the way through to you when you get to the age of 50, and you can access some money to reskill yourself, potentially to work in Cheltenham's Cyber Hub. In the NHS, we've got a plan to increase tax by 1p in the pound so we can invest £35 billion in our hospitals over the next Parliament. And also, crucially, we'll be ensuring that we are getting parity of care for people who suffer mental health difficulties alongside those who are suffering physical health difficulties. But, just to reiterate, we can't do this if we leave the European Union and tank our economy and remove all the funding that we need for our precious public services and fighting the environmental crisis. So that is why I urge you in this election to vote for the Liberal Democrats. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilkinson, and now we'll hand over to Mr. Rudgeon.
Yeah, I hope you don't mind me standing up. I washed my legs this morning and I can't do a thing with them. And I hope you students are better than me and read your own writing. My name is George Ridgeon. I'm standing in memory of a colourful Cheltenham character, Dancing Ken Hanks. In his lifetime, it's estimated he raised £1 million for Cheltenham and other Gloucestershire charities. He stood for the Monster Raving Loony Party because he knew Screaming Lord Sutch. You may obviously not have heard of him because he was a 60s rock star, and for a publicity stunt he stood in Stratford-on-Avon, I believe, in 1963, and actually I saw him in the Clifton Ballroom in Cheltenham High Street, and what an act. Dancing, so I'm standing in memory, that's why I'm standing in memory of Ken. 50 years ago, I was a fireman in Cheltenham. I was a young 24 when I joined, after 10 years in the meat trade, going to Cheltenham Technical College. And sadly, 16th of November 1981, and for those of you who got these magic phones, if you Google Gloucester Fire, 16th of November 1981, you'll see where I fell from and being tied on the back of a motorcycle, which is my own sport, raising money for charity. After 9 months in Stoke Mandeville Spinal Unit, I had 3 very bad years. And as you may realise, I didn't really want to live. Having been so active, I couldn't get in and out of bed. 9 months in a YDU, and life was very grim. And in fact, I've mentioned to your head teacher, if you would like to give me a talk about life before and after, and what you can still do and what you can do for the elderly and disabled and people of the country. But it was a few very good friends, and then meeting Dancing Ken at a country music evening. He didn't treat me as a disabled person. He said, "I'm Ken, what are you going to do to help me raise money for less fortunate people?" And I have found life got better when I found I could help people still, and stop feeling sorry for myself and feel sorry for somebody else. And now I've done that for 35 years. Now this is where I could do with some of my glasses. I have strong links with Cheltenham, going to Cheltenham Tech in '62 for 5 years, before joining the Fire Brigade. I joined the Cheltenham Motor Club in 1964 when I started racing a little BSA Bantam, moving to a Greaves and numerous other bikes, including the Isle of Man Manx Grand Prix. And then starting as a young fireman in Cheltenham Kensham Road in 1969, moving to Gloucester on promotion until the accident. I promoted motorcycle sport all my life. Now I have got a bet with, am I allowed to say the name of the bookie or just a book? With William Hill, who used to sponsor Dancing Ken's, because they knew Screaming Lord Such, and they sponsored the Monster Raven Rooney party to their deposit. And Dancing Ken asked me to take him. The reason I keep moving is I'm uncomfortable all the time, to save you asking. I'm paralysed with a broken neck. And I couldn't get into a new university building. I asked the then 3 candidates, excuse me, when I left school at 15, university meant clever, intelligent people. Can you tell me how they built a new university building 20 years after or more the 1970 Disabled Persons Act, and I can't get into it? So we stood in Tewkesbury and we gave our £500 to local charity. And that is why I've got a £100 bet at 300 to 1. And in the nice, so how many maths, how much is that then? Who's the first one to put their hand up? £100 at 300 to 1. No maths students? That's £30,000 I give to charity if I get 5% of the vote. And there's 20,000 people that don't vote. So if you can get those, a third of those 20,000 to vote for me, I give £30,000 to local charity. I'm not promising billions like the other 3 candidates. I am promising £30,000 that will be given to charity if I get 5%. Sadly, BBC Radio Gloucestershire are not allowing me on the debate, despite me paying my £500 to be a candidate, and there were only 4 candidates. After complaining to the BBC in London, they are now going to say that I am raising money in Dancing Ken. They're saying, hoping to raise. I said, I will raise it, I will give it if I get 5%.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rudgeon. We need to move on with our questions.
Right. Well, thank you.
So now we will take questions from the students which have already been prepared. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to answer each question. Firstly, starting off with Seamus.
So the question I have is, what university qualifications do you hold, and in what way do they qualify you to be an MP?
Mr. Chalk, if you want to start.
Wow, what an interesting question. So I've got a degree in modern history, and I've also got I did a law conversion course, so I got that from City University. How does that qualify me? Well, the thing that I've learnt being in Parliament is that you have to take an argument and you have to marshal the evidence and then make it in as effective a way as possible. And I'll just give you an example. So I had a situation where I had a constituent who was a Cheltenham GP. She had been horribly stalked by her patient over the course of 7 years. She developed PTSD, had to come off the register for being a doctor, truly appalling. But when the judge came to sentence her stalker down at Gloucester Crown Court, the judge said, I don't have the powers I need to keep this GP safe. So I looked into it, read about it, and then tried to persuade people in Parliament that we needed to change the law in order to make that GP safe. And it was only by working across parties and by using those skills that I developed as a barrister that I was able to persuade people. Equally with the net zero carbon bill, the most important single piece of legislation on environmental stuff for 10 years, that was about working cross-party and using that ability. The final point is, as a lawyer, it's incredibly valuable when you are a member of Parliament. I'll give you an example of that. When we wanted to stop certain downgrades in the hospital, what I'm aware of is sometimes you can challenge public authorities by a method known as judicial review. Effectively, you go along to a court and say they might want to try to do that downgrade, but they can't, and they can't do it because there are legal barriers to them doing so. So that combination of having a history degree, a legal background, to hone the arguments to be persuasive and to know what avenues of redress there can be. In other words, how you can stand up for your constituents, not just to be sort of loud about it, but to be effective at delivering stuff for the people you're entrusted to support.
Well, I have a law degree which I graduated from just this June, so there's a very real risk that if I go on for too long, I'll simply be repeating the things Alex said. But he's absolutely right. Law gives you skills in forensic analysis, a familiarity with the way legislation operates, with the way actually that some elements of our political system operate, which is sort of uniquely granted by that kind of background. It also gives you skills and practice in terms of presenting an argument, making oral representations both in a parliamentary context and in a simple interpersonal context. A debate with 5 people in a small office room somewhere can be just as significant as a major speech delivered in the floor of the House of Commons. But it's not just about what you did at your degree level, I think. I think that university is also about the experiences you gained outside it. And throughout my time at university, I was involved in a variety of student activism with the Labour Party and without the Labour Party, working with the local homelessness outreach project and working with people across our society to get an understanding of the points of view of those different to me. I've had a very specific experience in life, and every single one of us has our own little unique something which makes up the path we've taken in our lives. And I think one of the most important things for politicians to do is to sit back and listen to those people who are different to us, who've had a different life experience, who have different political opinions, and use that both to form our own views, but also to communicate those views on. And I think as MP, I'd have a unique capacity to do that and actually both communicate people's views, but also listen to those views and use them to develop my own opinions moving forward in my own advocacy.
How long have I got, sorry?
Yeah, 2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. Well, I have a degree in business from Cardiff University, and it taught me skills of critical thought and all the same things that these guys learned, except I don't have a law degree or any kind of legal qualification from Oxford. But what I would say, where I do agree with George, is that this isn't about where you went to university or what you got in your BA or your BSc or your BEd or anything else. It has been my life experience since I left university that has shaped the person that I am today and has made me the candidate that I am before you. So I did a degree that was a general degree. It equipped me with some skills. I got through it. Then I pursued a career in journalism, which turned me into someone who was very deeply invested in the things happening in my local community. I worked for my local hometown paper, which when I was a child, I delivered every Friday, on a Friday morning, got up at the crack of dawn to deliver the newspaper, which I then worked for and reported on in my hometown. I then got a job working for the Gloucestershire Echo. And then I became a communications professional. And then I got elected as a local councillor. And throughout that time, that has given me a huge amount of passion for and pride in the communities that I've been able to report on and the communities that I've been able to represent, from some of the most well-to-do areas in Cheltenham, around the park area, to some of the most deprived areas in Cheltenham, in Wadden. So I've got a key experience that is outside of my education, which has made me a good candidate. And linked to that, I would just go back to one of the points I made in my initial speech. Lifelong learning is a hugely under-considered part of our education system. And the Liberal Democrats at this election have a very exciting policy. It's called the Skills Wallet. And it basically means that if you get through university and school and you realise that you need to get some extra training, so maybe that's to work in the cyber park, maybe it's so you can be a project manager, maybe it's so you can become a local newspaper journalist like I did. We will give you access to several £1,000s at 3 different junctures in your life.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilkinson. That's the time over as well.
3 different junctures in your life, and it will mean that you are secure for the rest of your life in your job. Thank you.
I like your sign, do as much as you can, as well as you can. I hope the person who's voted in at this election keeps to that saying. I have a degree in life, having left Long-Leven Secondary Modern at 15 years old with nothing other than a report saying must try harder. I did go to butchery tech, learning meat hygiene and meat inspection. I found actually school wasn't actually very good. I may have been a slow learner because I used to be rubbing the chalkboard off before I'd written it down. So I think comprehensive, I went to secondary modern, whereas comprehensive, you're put into different sides. If I were elected MP for Cheltenham, I would try and make it a place that's equal to all, because I don't believe any of the planning authorities now have an access officer covering access issues. All the posts in Cheltenham are black, where suffers visually impaired. As I mentioned earlier, when I found I could start and help people, I learned about other disabilities problems. In butchery, as I said, I learned about meat inspection and meat hygiene. And in the fire service, I passed fire service exams up to the rank of station officer, which has the rank of the fire engineer, a graduate of the Institute of Fire Engineers. So I have knowledge in fire rescues and that terrible fire in London. Basically, the cost came in, cost cutting, and they were blaming the fire brigade for letting the people die when they didn't set the building on fire. So I urge whoever's voted in, they make Cheltenham a fairer place, better drop curbs for the elderly and disabled. There are some good ones, but some are not very good. I don't like the one-way system. The Cheltenham have never had very good one-way systems, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Now moving on to who has a question.
How will you ensure that housing for the poorest families, such as living in tower blocks like Grenfell, is safe and fit for a civilised society?
How will you ensure the housing for the poorest families living in tower blocks like Grenfell is safe, fit and civilised society? So Mr. Chalk, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, well, I'm very glad that you've raised that. What happened at Grenfell was one of the most appalling, chilling, devastating things that our country has ever experienced. And we need to take stock and be satisfied that as a country this can never happen again. That's point one. Point two, to think that people who might not have the same advantages as others could potentially pay for that with their life and security is dreadful. That should never have been allowed to happen. So the question is, how do you go about fixing it? Well, first of all, you've got to take things calmly and work out what went wrong. And that's why this inquiry is taking place before, I think his name is Mr. Justice Moore-Bick, to work out, was it the fact that it was flammable cladding or whatever? Get to the bottom of it. Are the building regulations wrong? Because there's a big sense that in fact there's so much complexity and lack of clarity about those building regulations, what went wrong. But one of the things I've learned in this job is knee-jerk reactions are a mistake. Yes, we are going to have a root and branch reform, but we've got to make sure that we do so knowing what actually happened. So that's got to take place. But the short answer is, if they're unsafe, they're going to have to be put right. And if that costs money, well, so be it. But there's a wider issue too, which is that we need to make sure that people going forward can live in suitable housing wherever that may be. So it might be in tower blocks, but what about places like Cheltenham, which need that additional housing? One of the things I'm so passionate about, so I've talked a lot about this cyber park, but we need to make sure that people like you or any of the people in this room could afford to live in Cheltenham, to work in that cyber park, so you don't feel priced out of town. That's why I'm in favour of building some additional homes, making them carbon neutral, by the way, and ensuring that we turn some of the retail, because we've got too many shop premises, into residential as well, so that we can unlock our town centre, provide affordable housing for people like you, and making sure fundamentally that it's safe.
Well, first I must begin by echoing entirely what Alex said about Grenfell being one of the worst tragedies that has befallen this country and is something which absolutely must be prevented. And the way we do that is by making sure, yes, that we review existing building regulations, but actually we ensure that cladding of the flammable kind which was on Grenfell is removed from buildings as immediately as is possible. The Labour Party would be making available funds directly to local authorities to ensure that that cladding was removed from buildings and that other flammable types of cladding, if and when they are identified, could also be removed. But we'd also be making sure that this was an expense not just borne by ordinary taxpayers, but that actually some of the expense was borne by the private building owners of buildings which have substandard cladding or are otherwise substandard in terms of fire regulations, by ensuring that local authorities had the enforcement powers necessary to force private building owners to make the modifications to their buildings which are required to ensure they are safe. Moving forward, we need to make sure that we're building tens of thousands of new homes, not in the interests of private profit by large house builders, but in a similar style to in Norwich, where we've recently seen a Labour council developed in-house a council estate which has just won the Rebar Architecture Prize. All of those homes are zero carbon, all of those homes are high quality places to live, and all of them are let at genuinely affordable social rents. And we will be making sure that throughout the next Labour government, tens of thousands of new social houses of that kind are built to ensure that the poorest in our society have a place not only they can afford to live, but which is of the very, very highest standard. We'll then be moving on to make sure that in the private rented sector, there are controls on rents. A national cap inflation to ensure that we don't see the spiralling rents we've seen over the last few years in this country, but with also additional powers at local authority level, so that if local people decide that rents are getting too high, additional controls can be put in to make sure that the rental sector is working not just for landlords, but for tenants as well. Finally, to ensure that security and safety of properties is paramount, both in the private and public sectors, we'll be introducing annual property MOTs, which will be undertaken by an inspectorate in coordination with local authorities to make sure that every single rented property is of a high quality, isn't infested with damp, doesn't have problems with its carbon output or any other issues which may arise, to make sure that everyone in this country has a safe and fair place to live at a good rent.
Thank you. Well, the Liberal Democrats would make good housing a human right, and that should be enshrined in law as best we can. The issue of Grenfell in particular is an issue about how we treat the poorest people in our society. If you listen to the feedback that's been given by people who were living in the tower, they basically felt ignored. And they took their case to the local council and they asked questions. This is all documented in the minutes of meetings at Kensington Council. And basically people were ignored over an extended period of time when they raised issues about the safety in their building and about the cladding. And this is all coming out through the inquiry. And the problem that we've got is that so many people in our society just feel like they don't have a voice and look like they're not listened to. And as a local councillor, I've felt that in my own ward. When we go and knock on people's doors in the area that I represent, a lot of them feel as if they don't have a voice. They feel disempowered, and that goes to the heart of the way in which our society operates. Now, there is a technical point about how we solve these problems, and it is largely, has been acknowledged by the other two candidates. It's about making sure that we've got better building regulations and better planning regulations to make sure that anything that is being built is being done in a way that is safe and that does not risk the kind of fire that we saw at Grenfell. There is a wider point about housing in general. In Cheltenham, I've made it my mission to bang on about housing as much as I possibly could, so we could try to solve some of the problems that we have locally. As a result of my campaigns, Cheltenham Borough Council is investing £100 million in new housing for young people and families in particular. And this housing will be delivered in a way in which the local authority is able to ensure that standards of the accommodation that are being provided for those people are of the very highest quality, including things like fire regulations, as you would imagine, as a minimum, but also in the deal that people will get when they sign up for the houses. They won't have to pay sky-high tenants fees, and they won't have to pay sky-high rents. They won't have to pay lettings agents hundreds of pounds every time they wish to renew their contract.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilkinson. So we have time for.
And I'm very proud to have done that. Thank you.
Now moving on to.
Region. It's region. I think a pigeon is region. When I started doing access to the disabled, I found in Gloucester, because I lived in Churchtown, which is just outside Cheltenham, that there were 40 applications a month for a housing alteration. That is about 250,000 properties in UK applying for an extension or an alteration. And as then the government the other day were saying that our population is growing older, this is over 20 years ago, I kept banging on about making Part M into alterations. If you're spending what is now probably £20,000 on a small kitchen extension, you make a door accessible, which makes it easier for the elderly and disabled to get in and out. And when I went to Parliament after the 2010 election, the housing minister, may have been a Liberal, but in conjunction with the Tory government, after I put this, said, we don't want to upset the builders. I said, aren't we a caring society? We are not a caring society. That has been proved. I can speak with some authority on fire regulations, because in the 70s we were making hotels safer. That's why they were more expensive. Everybody went to Spain. And in one hotel I went to, there was an open staircase from the ground floor to the 11th floor. That would have been all a fire on the ground floor, you would have lost all 11 floors. When I was at Morton the Marsh Fire College for 18 weeks over the years, we were taught any cladding had to be fire resistant. So how they fitted this cladding, somebody has broken the law or needs taken to task. We had fire regulations. I think Mrs. Thatcher's government made private building inspectors taking it out of the hands of the local authority. And when I was chasing up about somebody, the man who worked for NHCB, I've forgotten, I haven't contacted them because I'm getting old now. NHCB said, we don't want to upset our customers, the builders. They should be doing that for the people of Gloucestershire. The country, I mean.
The question I'd like to ask is, what plans does each candidate have in regard to student loans, and what would you do about university tuition fees?
You wanted to hear that again?
Yeah, could you?
It's about student loans and tuition fees.
Right.
Okay. So I think this is an important point for anyone who's considering going to university. Our solution is to have a review. We think that it is only right that after a few years of the tuition fees regime as it is being in place, we should have a review to establish whether it is working, so whether the universities have enough money coming in as a result of these financial instruments that have been put in place, and also whether it is the right level of fee being paid by students. So it may well be that some fees come down. And I think it would only be right. One of the things that was thought would happen after the tuition fees regime was changed was that different courses would be charged at different rates. What actually happened was that they all just charged £9,000 a year. Now, no one in the room should be under any misapprehension. There is no barrier to going to university. You don't have to pay before you get there. However, there is an issue about fairness, about how you then pay that back. And a final point, which is important for access. The Conservatives removed maintenance grants for the poorest students. We would reinstate them immediately without any kind of review.
Well, the Labour Party has benefited, I think, of the clearest policy on this point, which is to say that we will end tuition fees for students from September next year, because actually education is not just something which is nice to have, it's a simple moral right to which everyone should be entitled. Too much in this debate, we're going to hear ideas about the cost of education and the idea that it's something which is a personal enrichment, but simply that's not true. Education is a social good, and university education especially. If a person goes to university and studies engineering, they can go on build bridges which affect all of us. If a person goes on and studies art at university, they can create great works of art which benefit our entire society. If someone goes off and does a law degree, they can be a barrister, which I hope at least should lead us to be able to benefit all of us in society. And the Labour Party says that actually this should be accessible to everyone. We need to undo the perverse situation where we have at the moment, where those who are worst off in our society end up with the greatest levels of debt upon leaving university. So it's not just about bringing back the maintenance grants, which Max so correctly identified have been taken away by the last government, but actually it's about making sure that those maintenance grants are expanded and that we take away tuition fees so that everyone who wants to university can do so without having to worry themselves with debt and having to worry themselves with the costs in the future. And then moving beyond university, we need to be moving to a model where we recognise that not everyone wants to go to university at 18, that some people might want to go to university later in their lives, or indeed go down a more technical education route, and making sure that the funding is there through our National Education Service to provide the very high quality training to everyone throughout their lives who needs it, whether that be in the traditional academic education a little bit later on in the university at 18 model, or whether it is something else, a technical qualification, a degree apprenticeship, or anything in between.
Well, sounds attractive, doesn't it? But it's not as simple as that. And the reason why we know it's not as simple as that is if you look at the experience in Scotland, where they got rid of tuition fees, in fact, social mobility went into reverse. Why? Because if the state was going to fund all of it, that means a limited pot, and increasingly it just then became the preserve of the middle classes. Here in England, we have had more social mobility than ever before, more BAME students going to university than ever before, more people from a low socioeconomic background. And let's slay the myth that exists that the taxpayer doesn't put any money in. The taxpayer does. The taxpayer puts in £10 billion a year. To put that in context, the entire prisons budget is about £4 billion. But there's an important philosophical argument too. Some of you in this room will decide, do you know what? Actually, university isn't for me. Some of you will decide it is. Those who decide to go down the university route can expect to earn about another £250,000 over the course of their career. But what about the 18-year-old who says, do you know what? Nah, not for me. I'm going straight into the world of work. They will then pay taxes. And then comes the argument, sometimes expressed like this, why should, as it kind of might sound a bit politically incorrect, but you get the point. It used to be described, why should the dustman pay for the Duke? Why should that guy who goes into work or maybe does an apprenticeship, why should the entirety of the degree costs, which benefits someone who's going to make a bunch more money, why should that be purely paid for by his taxation? And that is something that has been said to me by young people in Cheltenham when they've been on an apprenticeship with BAE Systems or they're at Airbus. They say this isn't right. So it's about having a balance. But one thing I will say, I absolutely accept that the interest rate that exists on student debts has got to change, because at the moment it's too high and it compounds, and that's unfair. So I think we need to keep well-resourced education. But I'll just leave you at this point. If you were suddenly to get rid of tuition fees or to slash them, the University of Gloucester, for example, would really struggle. And this wouldn't mean just like, okay, well, we won't have quite as many welfare officers. This would mean courses cancelled, opportunities curtailed, and a less good and less bright future for our young people.
We'd have to cut the questions there short and move on to the questions directed at one candidate each.
You haven't had me speak yet.
Yeah, after Mr. Rudgeon.
Oh. Well, in 2010, that was all the questions. What about student fees? And of course, after the Lib Dems had to form the government with the Conservatives, and £9,000 came across. I think all education should be free, but many of my friends' sons and daughters went to college because it was a free ride, because everything was paid for. They were studying this, that and the other. I don't mind paying for something if you're going to use it, and use it for this country, and obviously not take your skills abroad. I would like to see more 3 hours in school, and there are a lot of people who aren't very academically like myself when I was at school, and they should be taught building trade, plumbing, electricity, and things like that, more practical things for those students. But I do think all education should be free, but you must use it. You know, you must want to do it, not go there for a free ride. If you're going to use it in this country, it would be nice to see free education. Thank you.
Recreational cannabis should be legalised. To what extent do you agree or disagree, and why?
So if you'd like to start off with Mr. Penny, since he hasn't started yet.
Yes. I think we need to review drug policy in this country and actually start to move towards a model where we look at addiction not as a criminal offence, but as a sort of social problem where it's actually someone has been spiraled into a position of addiction, and that means reviewing both cannabis and other kinds of drugs and the way we deal with it in relation to individuals using the drugs in question. We need to make sure that actually people aren't in the position they're currently in, where they can be exploited by county lines gangs because they fear going to the police because they might be arrested for using drugs themselves. So we do need to move in that direction. Legalisation of drugs, I think, is a matter to be investigated by a royal commission or other body properly suited to investigating the full social consequences of such a move. But I do think that we need to rethink how we deal with drug use in this country and rethink how we deal with addiction. So keeping very strong sentences and keeping strong positions on those who deal drugs, but actually moving to a model where we look to help those who are using drugs and are addicted to drugs rather than looking to punish them as well.
Mr. Wilkinson,
I agree with George. He's just given a neat summary of the Liberal Democrat policy, actually, but I'll put a bit of meat on the bones, because the Lib Dems are actually the ones calling for this at this election. We would decriminalise cannabis. So rather than having you able to go to the park at the end of my road and buy skunk, which will give you mental health difficulties, we would say if anyone wanted to buy it, they'd have to go and they'd have to buy it through a chemist or any other regulated business, which would mean we could control the supply. We could make sure that cannabis wasn't there and wasn't available in skunk form, which is the most harmful form. And not only could we do that, we could make sure that we were taxing it and we would invest that money in policing, on the policing of harder drugs. Now, the Conservatives will argue that, you know, we shouldn't decriminalise anything. We shouldn't think about the evidence that exists around this. But actually, we all know the war on drugs has failed, and prohibition of cannabis in particular has failed too. And we need to take a different look at it to make sure that we're treating addiction as a health issue and we're treating the social problems rather than criminalising weak and vulnerable people.
Okay. Yeah. That would be an argument for legalising everything. And certainly I agree with the idea that we should be looking at addiction as a health issue that we should cure. But I also think we need to listen to what the evidence and what the experts say. And the Royal College of Psychologists says, don't go anywhere near this. And they say don't go anywhere near it because of the levels of THC that now exist in a lot of modern cannabis, which can cause enormous difficulties for people, whether it's long-term psychosis or whatever. Now, the argument might be made by the Liberal Democrats, don't worry, we'll solve all your problems, because if we license the whole thing, all the bad skunk, no one tries it. That's not what happens, is it? What happens is the message goes out to young people, folks, you don't need to worry about cannabis, you don't need to worry about gear and skunk and stuff, it's actually perfectly safe. And so they then feel disinhibited to try this stuff. And the thing that I've seen in my experience as MP, where you speak to a mother who comes in with her child and says, do you know what, this child at 12, 13, 14 was doing so well at school, everything was going really well. And now, because he's got onto cannabis, his life is wrecked. Do we as a state want to be an accessory to that? Now, I'm perfectly prepared to accept, right, that for a lot of people, if you were to legalize their little bit of cannabis use from time to time, it's just not a big wow, it wouldn't be a problem. Why should the state interfere? That's not the problem. The problem is those vulnerable people who are sitting there thinking, shall I try this super strength skunk or not? And they're getting the signals from the state. And I think it's just too dangerous. And I worry about those vulnerable people. And I think we have a duty to try to ensure that we send out the right signals and keep them safe.
I've never taken drugs. Thank you. I've never taken drugs. I can be stupid enough without them. And I'm pleased to say I packed up smoking when I was 18 and tried to kill myself racing motorcycles. I do believe there are some medical benefits, which epilepsy and other things I've seen on television, which I think it can be treated as medical.
Yep.
I don't think any stimulant, my stimulant is motorcycle racing. I enjoy helping people, that stimulates me, and it gives me pleasure to help people and see people smile. Thank you, young. And as I said, I'd like to know more about the medical things, but how you cure it, I don't know. There are some nasty people out there, you know, we've been told if you get onto cannabis, you might then start try heroin and that. You know, don't do it. Keep off it. Don't start smoking. Just enjoy life and try and help people. Thank you.
I'm Will from Cleeve. Just wondering, couldn't there be some kind of middle ground when it comes to tuition fees? So instead of keeping it the same or completely getting rid of them, couldn't it be cut in half, for example?
Right. Can I go first? Yes, that's probably what the review, I think, would conclude. Based on the fact that tuition fees were supposed to be on a scale of, you know, what they were before, which was £1,000 to £3,000 up to £9,000. I think the review would probably rightly conclude that some courses would be cheaper, and if you went to do law at Oxford, for example, you'd pay probably quite a lot because your earnings potentials are high. If you went to do a vocational course maybe at the University of Gloucestershire, maybe you'd pay less because your earnings were likely to be lower. So I think that's the kind of fairness that we would like to see put back into the system, and that's what the Liberal Democrat policy is, basically.
Yeah, actually there's an outbreak of consensus. That's what the Auger Review broadly indicated. So there's already been a cap put on it, which of course means the value of it is eroded over time as prices go up, if you see what I mean. And also looking at this issue of the up to 6.1%, which is the really, really unfair aspect of it. Because apart from that, it's kind of really a graduate tax in the sense that you pay for it out of your earnings going forward. So I think the fair way to recalibrate it is to ensure that the sums are probably lower, that the interest rate is lower, there's proper support for people, so we can continue to have well-resourced universities, continue to have that social mobility which is going into reverse in Scotland, and ensure that people are in no way put off from something that can be, in the appropriate circumstances, the fantastic step on the ladder to true social mobility.
So first to say, Cleeve is my old school, so it's great to see it represented here, but further than that, I'd say that actually there's a real value in getting rid of tuition fees beyond the simple economic argument. And that does come back to this fundamental moral point that actually if you start to treat education as something which is a benefit only to the individual, you're missing the essential point of education at any level, but especially at university level, which is that education of that kind is capable of contributing to our society as a whole. And I just want to quickly take this opportunity to respond to a point Alex made, this sort of Dustman-Duke argument. Actually, a person who has far higher earnings potential will be paying a higher rate of income tax, will be paying a higher rate of tax generally in their life, and will give back to the costs of that university university education in that way and actually ensure that that fairness is maintained. So I do think that really we should be looking at no tuition fees because of what it says about what education is about, as well as the simple financial consequence for ordinary people trying to go to university.
I am not too sure how the fees work. Sadly, never married and had any children due to my accident. But as far as I know, you don't start paying until you get a job and a high-earning job. So I assume the government is already paying for that. There is only so much money to go around the country. If you give it to one thing, you take it away from the other. At the moment, I think the disabled and the elderly are near the bottom of the pile. As I said, I believe education should be free at hand, but there is only so much money there, and you don't pay anything. I believe there's interest on it again, isn't there?
Yeah, that's the
so
point,
if you
yeah.
borrow, well, if it's 9,000 a year and you're at school, that's £36,000 you owe the government. So if that keeps going up at I don't know what percentage, you're going to perhaps owe 30, 40 or 50,000 by the time you're earning perhaps 50, 60,000 pounds. But again, you only then pay so much money. So you don't actually pay it until you leave college. So only go to college if you know what you're going to do, and don't waste a student and go there and then not earn anything, because all you've done is cost the country a lot of money, which has been taken away from other people who perhaps need it more than you do. Thank you.
Good afternoon, my name is Jabir and I'm from Pittville School. And Mr. Chalk is introducing a new cancer clinic to Gloucestershire, I believe. And I was wondering what other public services that other parties are willing to invest in and offer us.
You want to go for?
So if you'd like to start off with.
So shall I? Thank you, Zubair. Absolutely. So I think wherever you sit in the political spectrum, you have to have a plan for what you want to do for public services. And the key thing for me in Cheltenham was that we'd had a history where we'd lost doctor-led maternity, we'd lost nighttime A&E, we'd lost battle-down children's services, and there was a real question mark about A&E in Cheltenham. But that rot has been stopped, A&E has been protected. But that's not enough. You can't just stand still. As soon as you stand still, you're going backwards. And so the reason why I want to do the Gloucestershire Cancer Institute is because if you want to have fantastic health services, and by the way, in Cheltenham, we already provide cancer care to as far away as East Clwyd in Wales, you've got to have the best clinicians. And the reason why I want a Gloucestershire Cancer Institute is because that means it provides opportunities for young oncologists who really want to make their name to come to Cheltenham and provide that fantastic care. But in order for that to be achieved, we need to have the latest technology. So we've got 4 new linear accelerator radiotherapy machines which provide that fantastic care, which track tumours, minimise collateral damage, and so on. But at the risk of stating the bleeding obvious, all of this is only achievable if you have an economy which is ticking forward, generating the tax revenues to make that happen, because that's something we haven't talked about yet today. We all want fantastic public services. We all want a Gloucestershire Cancer Institute, but how do we go about doing it? Have a strong economy is crucial.
Oh, do we not get to respond on that?
Hello, I'm George from Bournside School.
Nice part of the school broadcast there for you.
Take climate change seriously, but what was your party's proposed to actually deal with this issue?
The Labour Party is targeting net zero carbon emissions by 2030, and the way we're going to achieve this is through a £250 billion fund to invest in businesses, in the development of new infrastructure, and actually in bringing certain public services into public hands again so that they can be directed towards solving the climate crisis in the most efficient way possible. Yes, it is a very large amount of money, but it is money which will ultimately lead to the growth of our economy, ensure it is strong, and like Alex said, ensure we have the tax revenues in future to pay for it. Yes, it is a huge amount of money, but actually the costs of not acting are so much higher, not just in economic terms, but in social terms and in political terms. We have to act now, we have to do all we can, and that's why we're targeting 2030 nationally, which is the boldest target on offer from any of the parties at this election. We'll see the benefits of this even here in Cheltenham. We'll be investing in our local tech park to make sure that it is advanced and becomes an international climate centre of excellence. We'll also be investing money in our international diplomatic service to ensure that we can continue to put the argument for stricter action on climate change overseas as well as in this country, so we can have a global solution to this truly global problem.
Now to pass the question over to Mr. Redgen.
Get everybody going to work in a single car on a 125 motorcycle with about 200 miles to the gallon. I rode one in winters through the bad winter. Any new car driver that passes his test be limited to a 1000cc or less car for the first 2 years. Everybody, please note everybody, buy less clothes and throw them away the next day. Plastics, we must do something about plastics. I privileged to see David Attenborough in the Literary Festival. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and he's been campaigning on it. We must get rid of plastic, useless plastic. But in the last question, I'd like to say my 75th birthday, I know I don't look it, I've raised £1,000 and 1,000 to cancer, 1,000 to Alzheimer's, 100 to cancer, Alzheimer's, deaf, blind, and if I get my 5% back, all the charities in Cheltenham will get £1,000 at least. Thank you.
Reluctantly, I will bring this discussion back to Brexit, because this is probably going to be my last answer. So there are two key reasons why I think we should stop Brexit to help the environment. The first is about banking, because if we tank the economy by leaving the European Union, we're simply not going to have enough money to invest in the renewable sources of energy, in the sustainable transport schemes, and in planting the trees that we need to make sure that we can tackle the environmental crisis. The second is about the bandwidth in government. The civil service is now working overtime, planning for a no-deal Brexit in a year's time, which is a very likely outcome, and our civil service needs to be turned around and put towards working on the climate crisis. And aside from all that, there are a couple of other issues which are really important. The EU has been a huge driver for environmental legislation that the UK would probably not have adopted on its own. Think about air quality legislation, which our government has ignored and has been taken to the European courts over, and think about clean bathing waters. Without the EU, we wouldn't be safe swimming in so many beaches around our countryside and our coastlines. So let's consider that when we're looking at stopping Brexit.
Okay, so one thing is, in our country, we beat ourselves up a lot and we say we're not doing enough and stuff. And of course we need to do more, but just think about this for a second. Our country has reduced its carbon emissions on 1990 levels by 42%. That's better than the United States, than France, than Germany, or any other G7 country. Of course, we've got to get to net zero by 2050, which, by the way, is what the scientists said at the IPCC last year. They say that it's hard, it's achievable, and that's how we meet our Paris climate targets. But you want to know the specifics. I'll give you some specifics. 1, take coal out of the energy mix by 2025. China, by the way, producing 25 times more than us, is still building power stations. We've got to take ours out. We've got to have every new home by 2025, no gas boilers. Increase the number of marine conservation zones around the UK, but also our overseas territories, Tristan da Cunha, Ascension, and so on. Get plastic out of the environment. Drive down, through technology, vehicle emissions. Invest in hydrogen, carbon capture and storage. We have a plan for all this. I'm passionate about it, and we will deliver that better future.
Now we'll move to the final word by Mr. Net. Thank you very much. And can I just say a big thank you to all our candidates that are up for election. So thanks, George Ridgen, for taking the time out to come and speak to the young people of Cheltenham.
They want a photo with dancing Ken.
No problem, we'll try and get that booked in. Also to Max Wilkinson for representing the Liberal Democrats, George Penny, the Labour candidate, and Alex Chalk for the Conservative Party. And a round of applause for our candidates. We're delighted to host this for the Cheltenham Education Partnership because we've got Cheltenham Ladies College, Cheltenham College, Cleeve, Pittville, Bournside represented here, as well as All Saints Academy. So let's give a round of applause for all those students. And last but not least, to our chairs, to Alex and to Matt. And Matt, you've got the politest way of telling somebody your time's up, you know. Absolutely brilliant. But how well this has been chaired today. A round of applause to our chairs.